and it is being given by my colleague, Professor Alda Benjamin. She is an assistant professor of history at the University of Dayton, Ohio, where she teaches courses on the modern history of the Middle East. Recently, she was the Avi Malik Bet Youssef Faculty Fellow in the History Department and Middle East Studies Center at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of Assyrians in Modern Iraq, Negotiating Political and Cultural Space, published 2 years ago. And if you want to know more about her, you can read a little bit about her in the conference booklet. I'm not going to waste too much of your time. Someone that I'm proud to say is a colleague of mine and is someone that is doing some amazing work to preserve our heritage. She is going to be speaking about preserving modern history, archives, ethics, and community engagement. The floor is yours. Thank you, Alda.
Thank you so much to Dr. Nick and Rabbi Putros for a lot of difficult work they've done working on this, and also for the scientific committee that with me had a very difficult job of accepting over close to 100 applications, abstracts of that made us proud of this field that we study. So Shlama Lochen, اتلي إقارة إيوان من نوخن درتها أوديو مجد إلخا إقارة جورة قاتي اتلي قبل طيبوتا من مدبرانوتا جاوانيتا مردوتا اتآمانة سرياية بريشايت رابي كالدو رمزي وهلبت أبزة من قنطرن ات يونان هزايا أو تنباسي متخاتخة مدي صدانا متتمويدا لقرقزتون وجمتون قديا شلان قد آوخ ضيرة من نوخن همزم تدي بخليتون لي بدأويا بلشانة English. So I will turn to English now for my main talk, and talking about preserving modern history, archives, ethics, and community engagement. And thank you for staying until the last talk. I know many of you, including myself, are falling asleep. We've taken very long flights, some of you 30 plus hours, and you're here. So I'm very grateful for your presence. Okay, so in the early 20th century, Iraq began centralization policies that included the creation and organization of knowledge in national libraries and archives, usually excluding native, minoritized, and rural communities. Furthermore, coercive state policies adversely affected those communities with a primarily oral culture who witnessed the destruction of their cultural sites, while the displacement of their populations disrupted their agricultural way of life. Rural traditions that had been preserved orally for generations have slowly begun to disappear. But some scholarship, like my own on the Assyrians, has found ways to revisit existing sources, including the press, poetry, collections, works of literature, and arts, in order to gain new insight on these communities. I found that intellectuals took advantage of government policies gained because of the political climate, as well as the global elevation of folklore in the 1960s and 1970s. In my book, I mainly cover the 60s to the 1980s, but the conclusion sort of covers also the 90s and briefly brings it to the contemporary period. So folklore in the 1960s and 80s, basically, there was a global elevation of folklore at that time, which added a new appreciation for their villages and traditions, allowing them to reinsert themselves in the Iraqi national narrative that had excluded them. The private collections of individual scholars and the continuation of religious heritage preserved in monasteries, as well as the rise of secular community-based preservation efforts, thus fill an important gap. In this keynote, I will address the ways in which scholars can weave together both traditional and alternative methods to retrieve data that addresses these communities. The community's modern history, inclusive of their perspectives. So let me show you some of those traditional methods. For example, the Iraqi National Library and Archives in Baghdad includes Ba'athist sources, or actually 1960s Republican era sources that gives us really useful insight about these communities. The period I cover, the best census that we have, that we historians think is the best. Of course, everybody has their own opinions, and our colleagues in political science might disagree, but we think the 1959 census is the best. It had its issues, but still, you can look at just to sort of gain an insight about who are these communities, the Christians, let's say, at that time. So the very last category right here gives you the number of Christians in various provinces and cities. But then if we zoom in into the Mosul province, which at this time includes Duhok is not its own province yet, it tells you what the distinct particular districts, how high the number of Christians were. So when I talk about the political period and the opposition and such, you can sort of keep these numbers in mind. They were quite significant, I would say, even for a minority. And, police records tells how the state interacts with, or the judiciary institutions interact with citizens. Ba'athist archives that we have at the Hoover institutions, which very unethical practices of retrieving data from Iraq have technically returned, we hear, to Iraq in physical form. Libraries and archives, of course. And some of these centers are really wonderful. The Oriental Manuscript for Digitization in Erbil we will be visiting, so I will not talk so much about them, but are very useful also for the modern history. The Antonian Order collection, Dr. Abu Nasamir, abbot of this order, has a wonderful archival selection of material that we will be visiting, and so on. I will conclude my talk by shedding light on digitization and preservation efforts I'm engaged in diasporically and in Iraq, particularly focusing on the Syriac Heritage Museum, which we will head to this evening, as part of a USAID-funded digitization project with the Antiquities Coalition that I serve as research director. And that includes a few other local organizations, such as the CNMO, headed by Sayyidina Najib Mikhail. I hope to show that in locating under-examined communities within the context of modern Middle Eastern history, we deepen our understanding of the country's history and preserve evidence of its native pluralism without ignoring marginalization policies. Folklore in the 1960s and 1970s, a period that I think of as a grounding period, I'll be discussing. In 1974, an article appeared in Murdana Turaya, an Assyrian magazine published in Baghdad, describing the folk tradition known as Fire of February. The mountainous north experienced heavy snow and deep cold in winter, especially during February. Guided by church personnel, the villagers would begin collecting pine branches on the first day of the month and placing them in a designated area in the village. During the coldest day of February, the villagers would gather and set them on fire to mark the end of the coldest month of the year. They shouted, quote, like soldiers overcoming a fierce battle, while women ululated in delight, repeating the following refrain, Mata Shubat wal yati Athar, February is dead, let March commence. These ceremonies were important for intellectuals of the time as they provided opportunities to document and safeguard folkloric practices and to include these traditions within ongoing national and global trends attuned to folk revival. The 1974 article referred to the interchangeability between ancient and modern Assyrians, weaving a cultural thread tying them to their ancestral villages from, as the author noted, time immemorial. In those villages, Assyrians had remained observant of their language, traditions, and practices, continuing their cultural customs with complete pride, considering them an important and living part of their national immortal culture and humanitarian existence. The author reminiscent about the disruption of village life, like that had resulted from the immigration of the Assyrians to Iraqi towns and such as Baghdad, Mosul, Kirkuk, and Basra, but remained hopeful that these cultural traditions would be preserved in their hearts. He also stressed the importance of safeguarding these traditions, preventing them from becoming extinct due to the waves of immigration and exiles of recent times. Throughout the 1970s, articles like these appeared frequently in both Arabic and Neo-Aramaic publications as community writers grappled with the consequences of rural to urban migrations. In the second half of the 20th century, Iraqi Christians began migrating to urban centers in Baghdad, Kirkuk, and Basra in search of employment in modern professions, particularly in the oil and transportation industries. As they integrated into their urban neighborhood, they maintained and even strengthened their connections to their native towns and villages, attracting the attention of intellectuals and journalists interested in social and gender roles, marginalization, and folklore. In the 1970s, Baghdadi newspapers and journals catering to the general public as well as the community published articles of this kind. The interest in northern Iraq as a region and in the Christians in particular was a result of numerous intersecting cultural and political trends. It was the outcome of Assyrians' intellectual output and participation in a hybrid Iraqi cultural sphere, their increasingly noticeable presence in urban centers, and their activism in the Iraqi opposition, which was particularly strong in the northern towns and villages. In addition, in the early 1970s, this period were marked by episodes of negotiations between the Iraqi state and the opposition, as well as between the state and the international Cold War actors. The state was immersed in a cultural movement that had global implications and involved both aligned and dissident intellectuals. Community members writing in both Neo-Aramaic and Arabic became especially invested in this process following the passage of Law 251, which others have referred to. In their mostly bilingual newspapers and magazines, many of which were linked to cultural clubs, these intellectuals belonging to different Syriac churches discussed cultural, linguistic, and historical topics related to their community. As a result, the 1970s marked a period of optimism and intellectual growth, in which a plethora of publications appeared in both languages, while the broader Iraqi press significantly expanded the scope of its cultural coverage. In 1968, the Ba'ath came to power and began the process of securing hegemony over political groups that had historically opposed it, the Iraqi Communist Party and the Kurdistan Democratic Party. In addition, the government conceded rights to the Kurds in the March 1970 manifesto, which recognized Kurdish national identity and language and guaranteed Kurdish representation in both local and national governments. In 1972, to dilute the appeal of the Communist and the KDP to minorities, the Ba'ath also passed Law 251, which extended cultural and literary rights to speakers of the Syriac language, referring to the Eastern Neo-Aramaic speakers. The Ba'ath regime also engaged in cultural programs that attempted to reduce political dissent by recrafting historical memory as an amalgamation of Pan-Arabism, Mesopotamianism, and folk culture, with the intention of providing a limited cultural and political space where everyone could rally to strengthen the state. To further this agenda, efforts were made by the state to create new journals in Arabic and English, with a series of books on Iraqi folklore continuing to be published to a receptive audience. International conferences were held, ancient Mesopotamian cities were reconstructed, and museums and festivals were created. In 1969, folklore was further supported by the Iraqi state with legislation that created the General Directorate for Cinema and Theater, which was responsible for sponsoring folkloric festivals and promoting the arts along with the construction of a dance group. In addition, the state influenced the production of cultural manifestation by publishing ideological speeches and such. Meanwhile, intellectuals in these communities migrant communities, as well as those within the Iraqi political left, were very engaged in this space as well. Many of these publications that came into existence following Article Law 251 focus on the writers' towns and villages, allowing them to reminisce about the village life and cultural traditions that had been practiced since one writer has referred to as time immemorial. Local nostalgia for the village and its folklore was combined with efforts on the part of the community to document and preserve their cultural traditions. These impulses arose from an Iraqi national dialect that was in tune with the global discourse on folkloric revival. One of such magazines in the 1960s and really into the 1970s was a new magazine launched by the Information Ministry called التراث الشعبي, which highlighted the uniqueness of the Iraqi folklore with its ancient roots and celebrated the cultural diversity of its various ethnic and religious communities, albeit with nationalistic undertones. With the development of folklore, studies in the period following World War II, and especially the folk revival movement, which peaked in the early 1960s in North America, the interest in folk culture expanded beyond an elitist, romanticized urban understanding to include authentic voices from the countryside that were interested in documenting their culture and showcasing it within a larger national hybrid cultural dialogue. In Iraq, the national folk revival was being conceived in dialogue with a global movement in which the Iraqi state was willing to invest, highlighting its national folklore accomplishments, of course also using folklore for manipulation purposes. The subject of folklore also appeared in Iraqi women's magazines, which expanded their coverage to include northern Iraqi towns and villages. Interest in the village life and its folklore was portrayed in a magazine such as Al-Mar'a, which in 1977 featured an article titled Little Paris, penned by Egyptian journalist Hal al-Badri. While in Erbil for a work assignment, al-Badri was repeatedly advised to visit Ankawa, the village with a special flavor, as she called it. She in turn posed as a heritage collector, attempting to intermix with the rural communities and learn about their cultural traditions in Ankawa. Her article demonstrates how cultural rights granted by the government a few years earlier had developed a national interest in minority folklore and the villages where these traditions were still preserved. The limited government support sustaining these cultural projects, projecting minority culture and religious heritage beyond the nation. Hala al-Badri decided to venture beyond Erbil into Ankawa, then a small town on the outskirts of the city. While walking the streets, al-Badri gives an almost lyrical description of her disbelief that this was an Iraqi village, rather than a smaller Paris, as she called it, steeped, in her words, in the depth of a society of traditions, gripped by a nostalgic feeling that she was passing through a series of arresting love stories. She was invited by a group of women from Ankawa, talking on the street, to join them. Seated on pillows, they were dressed in their traditional clothing, a mix of Western and Chaldean. Their conversations concerned social traditions in Ankawa. The women spoke of love without restrictions, in which a young couple dates openly for a time as a precondition to matrimony. So she goes on describing how, love was spontaneous and getting to know each other was really a requirement for the families. And although she's simplistic in her understanding of gender relations, the article is reflective of the community efforts to include their heritage within the newly elevated platform of folklore. More critical, articles on the difficulties experienced by villagers outside of major city centers, such as Mosul, were published in Tariq al-Shab by Saadi al-Malih, a prolific writer also from Ankawa, who would become the general director of the Syriac Heritage in 2007. Countryside investigation, ŭકેszę. Emboldened by the increased coverage of being given to their villages in the Iraqi press and with government support, community intellectuals sought to publish in various outlets, including those founded by their community and its social clubs. Most of these issues were published in Neo-Aramaic and Arabic and included at least a couple of articles concerning folklore and village life. And as you can imagine, much appeared on ŭકેszę by, well, you will imagine once we visit it, by its natives now living in Baghdad. In 1974, an article appeared titled Countryside Investigation ŭકેszę was published by Bnyamin Haddad in قال سوريايا, a magazine produced by the Association for the Speakers of the Syriac Language. That was published in 1972. Haddad was a prolific writer, immensely active during this period. He gave an account of his village of birth, ŭકેszę, which he would expand on in subsequent decades through a series of linguistic, historical, and ethnographic articles. And he was still at work until his recent death, unfortunately. In a preface to his 1974 article, the editorial team provided a statement notifying readers that it was introducing the section Countryside Investigation as a service to history in order to shed light on the past and the darkness of the ages on the subject of their village and town. Towns, plural. So that knowledge would be formed about both their past and present. What Haddad and others were demonstrating about their villages in Nineveh was best captured by Hormuz Shisha Gula, who described this region as being ancient as humankind, noting that its history was narrated by the immortal relics of the past and that its village just were like living museum for folk culture, both in its intangible and tangible forms. Excuse me. Okay. Many of these historical accounts of ŭકેszę, for example, combined with the living memory of what formed the basis of the town's identity, a strong affiliation with the ancient Assyrian past and with the region's religious history as a center of the Church of the East and the location of the birth of the Chaldean Catholic Church. This emerging subfield of folklore within these bilingual Neo-Aramaic Arabic language newspapers was mostly produced in Baghdad by recently urbanized community members from northern Iraq. The editorial teams for these magazines, as well as their articles, tended to come from various Syriac denominations, all united by the shared language that they spoke, Neo-Aramaic. They all belonged to this milieu, but were fluent in Arabic as well. Perhaps the most illustrative example of this hybrid multicultural scene experienced in the late 1970s was the Assyrian page in Al-Ikha, a Kurdish newspaper appearing in Arabic and published in Baghdad. Indeed, many of the intellectuals and politicians active in the 1990s and 2000s either began their activities in or were strongly influenced by this earlier period that I describe and that I cover in my book. As a result, when the Kurdistan region was created in 1991, although it reinforced the distinct Kurdish national identity, there was room for the emergence of Assyrian civil society organizations and those belonging to other communities. Many of the intellectuals and politicians involved had already been active in the 1970s when the Ba'ath regime had passed Law 251. The teaching of Syriac language was a policy espoused by this law, though never implemented. It is thus not surprising that one of the first policies they lobbied for in the newly formed Kurdistan National Assembly pertained to the teaching of Syriac. In March 1993, its efforts were successful, and an official law permitting this was passed. Until 2004, the schools were fully funded by the Assyrian Aid Society of Iraq and its sister organizations. In 2010, the Ministries of Education in both the KRG and the central government provided partial support for the Syriac educational system. In 1993, the Directorate of Assyrian Culture was established in Erbil, positioned under the KRG's Culture Ministry, and officially housed in Ankawa since 1994. Likewise, a Directorate for Turkmen Culture was also formed. On July 25, 1998, the Directorate of Assyrian Culture published the first issue of Banipal magazine that continued until 2003, when it was stopped by the ministry due to funding shortages. It was restarted again in July 2022 under the direction of Keldo Ramzi, the new general director, however, without a designated ministerial budget. In April 2007, the Parliament decided to elevate the Directorate to a General Directorate and changed its name to the General Directorate of Syriac Culture and Arts. By becoming a General Directorate, a branch was also opened in Duhok in 2008. They established a library in Erbil with 10,000 valuable titles relating to the community, as well as a museum on April 11, 2011, we will be visiting this evening. In 2022, the Syriac Arts Ensemble was also established, creating a dance group that you all enjoy today. So I'm turning now to the present situation, if time allows me. Okay, I have about 4 minutes left. I'm committed to public engagements with questions of cultural heritage and the digital humanities. My goal is to combine a deep commitment to community-based collaboration with sensitive analysis of archival sources. USAID recently funded a 2-year extension for a collaborative project where we've been working on for 2 years prior, and we are in our 3rd year now for 1 more additional year, with the Antiquities Coalition that I serve as a research director. We digitize the heritage of Christians and Yazidis, communities displaced by violence in Iraq, and our local partners include the Dominican Center, the CNMO, the Syriac Heritage Museum, the Sinjar Academy, the Assyrian Aid Society, and also for the first leg of this grant, Yazda Foundation. And this is really important work. We're not only documenting and digitizing manuscripts, we're also digitizing and preserving some of the oldest photos that we have of Iraq, for example, that the CNMO has. We are creating intangible heritage videos, documenting songs, images, video of objects that we have in the museum, but also a lot of other intangible projects, and we hope to continue with this effort. So I'll show you some of the projects that I was engaged in. So first of all, Bnyamin Haddad, this is just before his passing that I visited. He has a really wonderful library. So a lot of these private libraries I've mentioned, of course, our churches and monasteries have been the main preservers for many, many centuries. Then we have secular institutions that also start collecting. But also a lot of times you have individuals, intellectuals with these really vast and valuable libraries that they open to visitors, people like myself. Also, when I was a fellow at Berkeley, we looked at the private collections that we had there, and we have acquired with my work there with the Bancroft Library, one of the libraries at the University of California, Berkeley. Heritage related to Western Americana, basically. This is how we were able to insert it. Librarians are wonderful, but of course we know that resources for them are very limited, so they cannot take things that they cannot be good stewards of. So this is how we were able to insert it, but the community engagement came not only in providing these sources, finding these individuals, but providing funding for the digitization policy. So here's a really well-known poet in Neo-Aramaic, Yosef Bit Yosef. He had these letters that were passed on to him, really wonderful letters from the village of Karajalu, excuse me. Okay. 1800s and onwards, private communication between a family from this village in Urmia with their son, who's a physician in the US, for example. Really, really difficult for us to find any material like this. We don't have preservation of our modern history, really, of families, of photos, so these are very valuable. This is just an image from our project and our partners here. The folk museum that we will be visiting, but something really wonderful that I had an internship class with my students. So these two students, undergraduates, they're not graduate students. Aaron and Charlotte were interested in women and gender issues, and we collaborated with the Syriac Heritage Museum to produce this online exhibit that was also in person. You can still see the online exhibit. It's done digitally, and it focuses on 4 women from the community. So it's called Women in the 20th Century, and it really is wonderful. And here's one example of this woman. And since we're focusing specifically, I wanted to focus on folklore, and we will be ending this wonderful day with folklore, visiting the Heritage Museum, the Syriac Heritage Museum. So this woman, Dr. Lely Tamurazi, born in 1992, is known as one of the important folkloric collectors and contributors to in song, in dance, and so much more. And we were able to acquire a lot of private collections from her and house them at the library, at least digitally in the museum. So thank you so much for your time. I really hope these efforts continue between us academics, those of us concerned with the protection of this really important and old heritage that we have, and reminding the people that we work with, everything we own is important. Not only are manuscripts important, but our families, our grandparents' heritage, that is also important. And it's really, it's not present in scholarship, and if we don't preserve it today, it will not be available, unfortunately. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Okay, everybody, that concludes our first day of the first Athra Syriac Symposium. I would like to thank you all for your patience and for your endurance being with us the whole day. And we are now going to slowly make our way out of the venue, and we will be going to the Syriac Heritage Museum at 6 p.m. and then we will have dinner there. Thank you very much.